In 1973, American housewives did something no one expected. They stopped buying meat. For 1 week that April, millions of families refused to walk into the butcher's aisle, protesting prices that had nearly doubled overnight. The papers called it the Great Meat Boycott. But here is what they did not report. Those families still ate, and they ate well, using recipes their mothers had taught them. Number 8 fed a family of 6 for under $1. Number 3 sat on the table of nearly every working household in America. And number 1 has been so completely erased that most people under 40 have never even tasted it. These 25 forgotten dinners carried Americans through the worst inflation of the century. Then we got comfortable and threw them away. Hit that subscribe button and let us count down the 25 forgotten poor man dinners from the 1970s no one makes anymore. Number 25, Welsh rarebit. Long before nachos and queso, the fanciest cheap supper a family in the 1970s could make was melted cheese poured over toast. A block of mild cheddar was grated into a saucepan with a splash of milk, a spoonful of flour, a shake of dry mustard, and a little Worcestershire sauce, then stirred until it turned into a thick golden sauce. Mothers poured it steaming over slices of toasted white bread until the bottom went soft and the top stayed glossy. A pound of cheese ran about $1 in 1974, and it stretched across a whole family with bread that was already in the box. The English called it rarebit. American kitchens just called it cheese on toast and served it on Friday nights during Lent. It tasted rich, sharp, and far more expensive than it was. Today we pay $6 for a grilled cheese at a cafe and have no idea this ever existed. Number 24, creamed peas on toast. This was the meal that turned a 10-cent can of peas into something that looked like it belonged in a restaurant. A pat of butter melted in a saucepan. A spoonful of flour was stirred in, then milk was poured slowly until it thickened into a white sauce. A can of peas, drained, went in last and warmed through. Mothers ladled the whole creamy mixture over buttered toast and dusted it with black pepper. The peas burst soft and sweet against the salt of the butter, and the toast went tender underneath. A can of peas cost around 15 cents, and the sauce was built from pantry staples every kitchen already kept. For families stretching a paycheck through a long week, this was a complete hot supper that asked for nothing fresh. It appeared in church cookbooks and on hospital trays alike. Today, nobody creams anything anymore, and the dish has vanished without a single person noticing it left. Number 23, fried bologna sandwiches. Every working-class refrigerator in the 1970s held a thick roll of bologna because at around 69 cents a pound, it fed a family for days. But fried bologna was not the cold lunch you slapped together in a hurry. Mothers cut the slices thick, notched the edges with a knife so they would not curl, and laid them in a hot cast-iron skillet until they blistered and browned and swelled up in the middle like a little dome. The smell pulled children in from the backyard. Served on white bread with yellow mustard and a slice of American cheese, this was a proper hot dinner, not a snack. Fathers ate it after the late shift. Kids ate it before school. There was no shame in it because half the neighborhood was frying the same thing in the same kind of pan. We replaced it with deli turkey and forgot how good a blistered slice of bologna could taste. Number 22, tomato and rice soup. When the cupboard was nearly empty and payday was still 2 days off, this was the meal that filled a pot for almost nothing. A can of tomatoes was crushed into a saucepan with water, a chopped onion, salt, and a handful of rice, then simmered until the rice swelled soft and the broth turned thick and tangy. Some families added a pinch of sugar to cut the acid, and a knob of butter floated on top if there was any to spare. A can of tomatoes cost about a dime, and rice was the cheapest thing in the pantry. The whole pot fed a family of 5 with enough left for the next day's lunch. It was warm, sour, and surprisingly satisfying, the kind of soup that sat heavy and kept you full through a cold evening. Today, canned soup costs more than the homemade version ever did, and almost no one knows you can build a meal from a can of tomatoes and a cup of rice. Number 21. Beanie Weenies. 2 ingredients, 1 pot, and a dinner that kept American children alive through the 1970s. A can of pork and beans dumped into a saucepan, a package of hot dogs sliced into coins, a squeeze of mustard, and a spoonful of brown sugar or ketchup stirred in for sweetness. It simmered for 15 minutes until the beans bubbled and the hot dogs plumped up and soaked in the sauce. A can of beans cost around 20 cents, and a package of hot dogs ran about 69 cents, so the whole pot came in under $1 and fed everyone twice. Camp cooks made it. Tired mothers made it. Fathers home alone with the kids made it because it was the one thing they could not ruin. It was salty, sweet, and smoky all at once, and it landed on tables from trailer parks to suburban kitchens. We call it kid food now and feel embarrassed by it, but it fed a generation. Number 20. Fried Spam and Rice. That blue and yellow can was in nearly every American pantry, a relic of wartime rationing that the lean years of the 1970s brought roaring back. Mothers sliced the Spam thick, fried it in a dry skillet until the edges caramelized and the fat crisped, then served it over a mound of white rice with a little of the pan dripping spooned on top. Some families splashed soy sauce over it. Others laid a fried egg across the whole plate. A can of Spam cost around 50 cents, and a bag of rice was pennies a serving, and together they made a hot, salty, filling supper that needed nothing fresh from the store. Hawaiian and Filipino families in particular kept the tradition alive, but it spread to working kitchens everywhere. Money was tight. The salt and fat carried it. The rice stretched it. Today, people sneer at canned meat, but in 1975, a fried slice of Spam over rice was dinner, and dinner was a good thing. Number 19. Buttered egg noodles. Sometimes there was no meat at all, and the meal was simply a bag of egg noodles boiled, swanned, drained, and tossed back in the pot with butter, salt, and pepper. If there was a can of peas or a handful of cheese, those went in too. The noodles came out slick and rich, each one coated in melted butter, and a hungry family ate them by the bowlful without a word of complaint. A bag of egg noodles cost about $1 and fed everyone with leftovers. German and Eastern European families across the Midwest leaned on this hard, sometimes browning a little of the butter first to give it a nutty depth. It was plain, it was honest, and it filled stomachs on the nights when the refrigerator held almost nothing. We pay restaurant prices for buttered pasta now and call it a side. For a 1970s family, it was the whole supper, and it was enough. First pattern break. Here is where the story of cooking in the 1970s gets interesting. In 1971, General Mills launched a product called Hamburger Helper, and it changed how America ate forever. The pitch was simple. Take 1 pound of ground beef, which had suddenly become expensive, add a box of seasoned noodles or rice, and feed a family of 5. The timing was perfect. Beef prices were climbing toward record highs, and families needed to make a single-pound stretch further than it ever had before. But here is the part the commercials never said out loud. Every single thing in that box was something mothers had already been doing for free. Stretching meat with starch, with rice, with noodles, with sauce, was the oldest trick in the poor man's kitchen. Food companies took grandmother's wisdom, sealed it in a box, printed a smiling glove on the front, and sold it back to us at a markup. We paid for the convenience of forgetting what we already knew. Number 18, liver and onions. Beef liver was one of the most nutritious foods a family in the 1970s could put on the table, packed with iron and protein, and it cost only about 49 cents a pound because almost nobody wanted it. Butchers practically gave it away. Mothers sliced it thin, dredged it in flour, and laid it into a hot skillet for barely 2 minutes aside, while a second pan filled with onions cooking down sweet and golden. The trick was speed. Cook it too long and it turned tough and bitter, which is exactly why a whole generation grew up hating it. Done right, the outside was crisp and the inside stayed faintly pink and mild. The onions piled on top in a soft, sweet heap, and the whole thing sat in its own drippings beside mashed potatoes. It was a complete, deeply nourishing meal for almost nothing. We stopped making it because we could finally afford to. The nutrition did not go anywhere. The knowledge did. Number 17, salmon patties. Before tuna took over the pantry, canned pink salmon was the cheap fish that held American kitchens together. A tall can cost about 50 cents in the mid-1970s. Mothers drained it, crushed the soft bones right into the meat for extra calcium, and mixed it with a beaten egg, crushed crackers, a little chopped onion, and a spoonful of mustard. The mixture was shaped into patties and fried in a skillet until a thin golden crust formed, and the inside stayed moist and pink. Served with creamed peas or stewed tomatoes and a wedge of cornbread, salmon patties felt like a diner supper at a fraction of the cost. Children who swore they hated fish ate these without a second thought. The recipe lived in every women's club cookbook in America and on 1,000 index cards in 1,000 kitchen drawers. Then, canned salmon got expensive, tuna got cheap, and the patty quietly slid off the American table for good. Number 16, stewed tomatoes over toast. This was the meal that proved you could feed a family from a single can. Whole canned tomatoes were poured into a saucepan, broken up with a spoon, and simmered with a knob of butter, a pinch of sugar, salt, and pepper until they thickened and turned glossy. Then, the whole sweet, tangy mixture was ladled over slices of buttered toast that softened beneath it and soaked up the juice. A can of tomatoes cost around 12 cents, and the bread was already on the counter, so dinner came together for almost nothing in under 10 minutes. Southern and Appalachian families made this constantly, often adding torn bread right into the pot so it dissolved into a thick, comforting mush. It was warm, bright, and filling in a way that seemed impossible for something so cheap. Today we would call it a deconstructed something or other and charge $9 for it. Back then it was just Tuesday, and it kept everyone fed. Number 15, unstuffed cabbage skillet. Stuffed cabbage rolls were a labor of love that no tired mother had time for on a weeknight, so the 1970s gave us the lazy version, and it was better anyway. A head of cabbage, chopped rough, went into a skillet with a half pound of browned ground beef, a cup of rice, a can of tomato sauce, and enough water to steam it all soft. 25 minutes later, the cabbage turned silky, the rice swelled tender, and the beef flavored everything around it. A head of cabbage cost about 15 cents and could feed a family for 2 nights, while the rice stretched a tiny amount of meat across a whole table. Polish and Eastern European families across the industrial Midwest made this when the cabbage was cheap and the paycheck was thin. It looked like real cooking and tasted like comfort. We forgot it the moment frozen dinners promised to do the work for us, and we lost something honest in the trade. Number 14. Pork, neck, bones, and rice. When ground beef climbed out of reach in 1973, smart cooks turned to the cuts nobody else wanted, and pork neck bones were the cheapest meat in the entire store, often just pennies a pound. They were mostly bone, but what they gave up during long cooking was extraordinary. Mothers simmered them for 2 or 3 hours with an onion and plenty of salt until the broth turned rich and the little bits of meat fell tender off the bone. That meat was picked off and served over a mountain of white rice, with the savory cooking liquid spooned across the top. Black families across the South and the great migration cities of the North kept this tradition strong, eating well on what the butcher considered scraps. The dish was deeply flavored, filling, and almost free. It built generations of working Americans who never had $1 to waste. Today, neck bones cost more than they should, and most people would not know what to do with them. Second pattern break. Here is the part the grocery chains would rather you not think about. The reason these meals worked is that they were built on ingredients no one can mark up. Dried beans, rice, cabbage, neck bones, canned tomatoes, day-old bread. There is no advertising budget behind a sack of rice. There is no brand loyalty in a head of cabbage. When meat prices doubled in 1973 and families launched that nationwide boycott, they did not go hungry. They simply reached back into the old playbook their mothers and grandmothers had handed them, the one full of dishes that used the cheapest things on the shelf and made them taste like more. The food industry's entire job since then has been to convince us that cooking from scratch is too hard, too slow, too much trouble, so we would buy the box instead. The arithmetic has never changed. A pot of rice and neck bones still costs less than a frozen dinner and feeds more people. We just stopped believing it. Number 13. Creamed chipped beef on toast. The soldiers who came home from Korea and Vietnam had a far saltier name for this dish, but every mother in America knew it as creamed chipped beef on toast. Thin slices of dried salted beef came in small glass jars for about 50 cents, and they were torn into strips and stirred into a thick white sauce made of butter, flour, timothy, and milk. The salt from the beef seasoned the whole thing without any extra effort. Poured over white toast, the sauce soaked in and turned the bread soft and rich. Veterans brought the recipe home from the mess hall because it was fast, filling, and nearly impossible to ruin, and their wives recognized it instantly as the kind of thrifty supper they had grown up on. It appeared as a weeknight dinner, a quick lunch, and a Sunday breakfast all across the 1970s. Today it survives only in jokes about military food, but in a working kitchen, it was a hot, hearty meal for almost nothing. Number 12. Vienna sausages and crackers. Some dinners in the lean years existed for one reason only, to fill a stomach with whatever was cheapest. A can of Vienna sausages cost around $0.25, and a sleeve of saltines was $0.10. For a family at the very end of the week, that was supper. The little sausages were eaten straight from the can, sometimes warmed in a pan, sometimes wrapped in a slice of bread, always with a stack of crackers alongside and maybe a smear of mustard. There was no pretending it was elegant, but it was protein, it was salt, it was food on the table when the refrigerator was bare and the next paycheck was still days away. Truckers kept cans of it in the glove box. Mothers kept it in the back of the cupboard for the nights the math did not work out. It was the floor of the 1970s kitchen, the meal that stood between a family and going to bed hungry. Nobody bragged about it, but plenty of people remember it. Number 11. Pancakes for supper. There was a quiet rule in a lot of working homes that said when there was nothing else, there was always breakfast. Flour, a little baking powder, an egg, milk, and a spoonful of oil made a batter that cost almost nothing and fed everyone at the table. Mothers stacked the pancakes high, melted a little margarine across the top, and poured on syrup, or if syrup was gone, a mix of sugar and hot water boiled down into a thin glaze. Children thought it was a treat. They had no idea it meant the money had run out. A few cups of flour and a single egg could feed a whole family for pennies, and the warm, sweet plates landed on the table fast on the nights when nothing else was possible. Pancakes for supper carried families through the worst weeks without anyone feeling deprived. We treat breakfast for dinner like a fun novelty now. For a family in the 1970s, it was often the most honest meal of the week. Number 10. Spanish rice. Long before rice bowls became a trend, the 1970s working kitchen turned half a pound of ground beef into a full skillet dinner with rice and a can of tomatoes. The beef was browned with onion and a little green pepper, then raw rice was stirred into toast in the drippings. A can of tomatoes and some water were poured over, and the whole thing simmered, covered, until the rice drank up the liquid and turned tender and red. A dash of chili powder gave it warmth. The rice doubled the volume of the meat for almost nothing, so that small amount of beef fed 5 people without anyone feeling shortchanged. It cost well under $1 for the whole skillet, and reheated even better the next day. Families from the Southwest to the industrial North kept this in heavy rotation, especially after meat prices spiked. It looked like a real hearty dinner because it was one. We swapped it for boxed rice mixes and lost the recipe that was already cheaper. Number 9. Sloppy Joes. In 1969, a can of seasoned tomato sauce called Manwich hit the shelves, and by the mid-1970s it was a staple of the American weeknight. But the genius was older than the can. Brown a pound of ground beef, stir in the sweet, tangy tomato sauce, and pile the whole thing onto a soft hamburger bun. The meat went further because the sauce stretched it, and a single pound fed the whole family with the bun soaking up every drop. A can of sauce cost around 40 cents, and a package of buns about 30 cents, so dinner was cheap, fast, and exactly the kind of messy that kids loved. Mothers who did not buy the can simply made the sauce themselves from ketchup, mustard, brown sugar, and a splash of vinegar, which cost even less. It was the perfect inflation meal, a little meat made to feel like a lot. The Sloppy Joe survives in school cafeterias, but the homemade weeknight version has mostly faded away. Number 8. Hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes. Farmers called it poor man's steak. Mothers called it hamburger gravy. The kids just called it supper. A half pound of ground beef was browned in a skillet with diced onion. Then a spoonful of flour was stirred in to coat the meat, and milk was poured over slowly until the whole thing bubbled up into a thick, savory white gravy shot through with beef. It was ladled over a mountain of mashed potatoes until every bite carried both. Ground beef ran about 89 cents a pound in 1974, and a bag of potatoes was barely $1, so this fed 6 people for well under $1 a plate. The gravy soaked into the potatoes, and the whole plate was heavy, rich, and deeply filling in the way that only starch and fat can be. It showed up on tables from ranch kitchens in Montana to apartments in Detroit. It needed no fancy name and got none. It was simply one of the best cheap dinners America ever made. Third pattern break. Here is something nobody likes to say out loud. By the mid-1970s, food stamps were keeping millions of American families fed, and there was a deep, quiet shame attached to it. Inflation had gutted paychecks, Factories were closing, and the proud working families who had always made it on their own suddenly could not. These meals mattered because of that shame as much as the money. A casserole that looked like real cooking, a skillet of hamburger gravy that smelled like a Sunday dinner, a sloppy Joe that a child could be proud to bring a friend home to. Those things let a struggling family hold on to their dignity. The point was never just calories. It was the feeling of setting down a real meal at a real table and saying, "We are still all right." That is what the casserole culture of the 1970s was really about. It was poverty cooking dressed up just enough to keep a family's head held high. Number 7. Chili mac. When chili alone would not stretch far enough, a box of macaroni turned it into a meal that fed twice as many people. A little ground beef was browned with onion. A can of beans and a can of tomatoes went in with chili powder, and cooked elbow macaroni was folded through until everything came together, thick and hearty. The pasta soaked up the chili and made a tiny amount of meat disappear into something that filled a whole pot. A box of macaroni cost about a quarter, the canned goods a few dimes, and the whole thing fed a family for 2 nights and tasted better on the second. School cafeterias served it, church basements served it, tired mothers served it because it was nearly impossible to ruin, and it kept everyone full. It was the kind of food that warmed a cold house and emptied a hungry table. We buy boxed versions of it now, but the homemade pot was always cheaper and always better. Number 6. Tater tot hottish. In Minnesota and across the upper Midwest, this was not a casserole. It was a cornerstone of the church supper and the weeknight table alike. A layer of browned ground beef, a can of cream of mushroom soup mixed with a little milk, a layer of frozen vegetables, and then a tidy roof of frozen tater tots laid edge to edge across the top. It baked for 1 hour until the tots turned golden and crisp, and the creamy filling bubbled up around the edges. A bag of tots cost about 50 cents, a can of soup around 20 cents, and the dish fed a crowd for next to nothing. Lutheran church basements ran on this. Funeral luncheons ran on this. It was hot, filling, and endlessly forgiving. The kind of meal you could throw together from whatever was in the freezer. It still survives in pockets of the Midwest, but most of America has forgotten the humble, brilliant economy of it. Number 5. Goulash. It bore no resemblance to anything Hungarian, but every American kitchen in the 1970s called it goulash, and it was the ultimate clean-out-the-cupboard dinner. 1 pound of ground beef browned in a pot, a box of elbow macaroni, a can of tomatoes or tomato sauce, a chopped onion, and enough water to cook the pasta right in the same pot. 20 minutes later, you had a thick, savory one-pot meal that tasted like a stripped-down version of every casserole Grandma ever made. In some regions, it was called American chop suey. In others, just goulash. But everywhere it was cheap, fast, and beloved. A whole pot cost under $1.50 and fed a family for days, getting better each time it was reheated as the sauce soaked into the noodles. It was the meal mothers made when they were too tired to think, with ingredients that were always on hand. It fed millions without complaint and then quietly slipped off the American table. Number 4. Hamburger Helper. It feels strange to put a boxed product on a list of forgotten home cooking, but the original 1970s versions are nearly gone, and what they represented is gone entirely. When ground beef became a luxury, a 50-cent box of seasoned noodles or rice turned a single pound into dinner for 5. You browned the meat, dumped in the box and some milk and water, and simmered it until it thickened into a creamy, comforting skillet meal. Cheeseburger macaroni, beef stroganoff, hamburger hash. Each one let a struggling family put a hot, filling dinner on the table fast. It was the box that admitted out loud what every mother already knew, that meat had to be stretched to survive the decade. It carried countless families through the worst years of inflation and unemployment. Today, the meal feels like a punchline, a relic of a less sophisticated time. But for the people who lived on it, it was a lifeline, and it deserves to be remembered for what it really did. Number 3, bean with bacon soup. If meat was out of reach, a pound of dried navy beans was the cheapest, most sustaining thing a family could buy, often just a dime a bag. The beans were soaked overnight, then simmered for hours with an onion, a chopped carrot, and whatever scrap of bacon or salt pork was on hand until they broke down and thickened the water into a creamy, smoky soup. A few strips of bacon, fried crisp and crumbled on top, turned it into something that tasted far richer than its cost. Served with crackers or a wedge of cornbread for dunking, this pot fed a family of 6 for 2 full days for well under $1. Working families across every region of the country leaned on it through the hard years, and it appeared in nearly every community cookbook of the decade. Campbell's sold a canned version, but the homemade pot was cheaper, better, richer, and endlessly forgiving. We traded it for the can and never noticed what we gave up. Number 2, scalloped potatoes and ham. This was the meal that turned the last scraps of a Sunday ham into a whole new dinner. Thinly sliced potatoes were layered in a baking dish with chopped leftover ham, dusted with flour between the layers, dotted with butter, and covered with milk, then baked slowly until the potatoes went tender and the top browned into a bubbling golden crust. The milk and flour thickened around the potatoes into a creamy sauce, and the salty ham flavored every bite. A few potatoes, a little leftover meat, and some milk made a dish that fed a whole family and felt like comfort itself. Nothing went to waste, which was the entire point in a decade when wasting food was unthinkable. Midwestern and rural families made this constantly, especially in the cold months when a hot dish from the oven warmed the whole kitchen. It cost almost nothing because the ham was already paid for. Today we buy ham fresh and toss the bone, and the scalloped potato dinner has nearly disappeared. Number 1, tuna noodle casserole. At the very top of the list sits the dish that defined the 1970s dinner table and has now been almost entirely erased. A can of tuna, a bag of egg noodles, a can of cream of mushroom soup, a handful of frozen peas, all stirred together in one dish and baked until it bubbled, often with a crunchy topping of crushed potato chips or crackers across the top. A can of tuna cost around 35 cents, the soup about 20 cents, and the noodles a quarter, so the whole casserole fed a family for under $1 and reheated perfectly the next day. The cream of mushroom soup was the secret engine, turning a few cheap ingredients into something creamy and warm and familiar. From 1965 to 1985, this was Wednesday night in millions of American homes. It was the meal a mother could make with her eyes closed, the one that smelled like every childhood kitchen in the country. Then tastes changed. Casseroles fell out of fashion, and we abandoned it almost overnight. No single dinner fed more American families through the lean years, and no single dinner has been more completely forgotten. This is the one we should remember most. Here is the challenge. Make one of these this week, just one. The salmon patties, the hamburger gravy, the bean with bacon soup. Then come back and tell me if it was as bad as you expected, because I made the tuna noodle casserole and my kids asked for it again the next night. Drop the one you are going to try in the comments. I want to know if the goulash gets more love than the sloppy joes. because these were not meals of defeat. They were how a whole generation got through, and they fed their families well.